patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 135 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me, whether you're tuning in for the first time or you've been with us since episode 1. Welcome to the program. I hope you are enjoying the holiday season. Maybe you have some plans coming up for the winter holidays and for the new year. This is our final episode of the year 2023, which is just unbelievable to even say, but here we are. Before we get to our episode, as always, a big shout out and thank you to our Patreon supporters. They really put so much effort into supporting the program, and I just once again want to acknowledge and express my gratitude for these amazing people, and also thank you to the listeners who subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens. You are obviously the main purpose why we have this podcast, so I just want to remind everyone of the essential role that you play for this show. I also have some announcements next year. I just want to kind of plan in the seed here for thought, a plan for some additional help onto the podcast. So I will let you all know in the new year in 2024. But let's get right into our program. Today is a Sacred Honor Series episode. It is the final episode for the New Jersey delegation. And the final gentleman we are speaking about today is Abraham Clark. Clark was born in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Of course, it was known as a province at the time in British America. Born on February 15th, 1726. He was actually born in more of a middle-class background. He actually had a very good knowledge of mathematics. And so he became a bit of a surveyor through his father, teaching him how to become one. He taught himself law. And you would think that someone like him, obviously very, very intelligent, very bright man, you would think that he would be a prominent lawyer, kind of someone like John Adams, but he actually never passed the bar. I don't know if he just never took it or just was never admitted, but he still nonetheless wanted to serve for his community. And that's one of the key tenets of Abraham Clark. And it certainly is a theme for several other signers too. Again, the signers really differed on their backgrounds. Many of them were wealthier. Clark was kind of one who was, I guess, in the lower end of the wealth spectrum. He was a slaveholder, which was very much the norm at the time for many people. He was one to learn how to defend and really got his passion for defending people who were not as well off. And I thought this was very interesting. Again, I'm coming in here with a lot of these episodes, with the exception of the big ones, Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, which will be covered later on in the series. But for Clark, and for a lot of signers, for those of you who've especially been following this series, you'll know that I am going into these episodes really not knowing much about these signers. And what I find very surprising, you will see with the theme of Abraham Clark as we can go on later, is that he was one to really champion what at that time was very radical ideas of democratic participation. And he really believed that there was a huge opportunity to have the states, particularly his new state of New Jersey, to really boost the industrial sector and not just the wealthiest people in the state. He married Sarah Hatfield, and they both had 10 children, which anyone will probably know is probably a lot of people to take care of, especially in that time. He had 2 sons who served in the American Revolutionary War. I believe they both fought in the battles of Trenton and Princeton, which is very, very admirable. He did enter the service in terms of serving for the crown for a few years in the 1750s and the 1760s. He was the High Sheriff of Essex County, and he was also the clerk of the colonial legislature in New Jersey. He strongly supported independence and served in the Provincial Congress of New Jersey, and picked by the people there to represent the colony of New Jersey at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He was very close with John Witherspoon, whom we've covered a few episodes ago. Clark wrote a very interesting letter to his friend Elias Deaton on the early hours of the 4th of July, July 4th, 1776. He wrote, quote, "Our Congress resolved to declare the United Colonies free and independent states. A declaration for this purpose, I expect, will this day pass Congress. It is nearly gone through, after which it will be proclaimed with all the state and solemnity circumstances will admit. It has gone so far that we must now be a free, independent state or a conquered country. This seems now to be a trying season, but that indulgent Father, who hath hitherto preserved us, will I trust appear for our help, and prevent our being crushed. If otherwise, his will be done." He later wrote to the same friend and wrote, "Our Declaration of Independence I dare say you have seen. A few weeks will probably determine our fate, perfect freedom or absolute slavery. To some of us, freedom or a halter. Our fates are in the hands of an almighty God, to whom I can with pleasure confide my own. He can save us or destroy us. His counsels are fixed and cannot be disappointed, and all his designs will be accomplished." Unquote. I think the way he put this not only was delivering the message of independence, but also put the fate into God and into his faith. He also made very clear that this is a clear choice. This was not one of those compromises of whether or not to have some freedom and accept some slavery. He felt that this was a choice at the crossroads between freedom and slavery. Having that definitive voice, especially as a delegate there, knowing that a lot of the delegates had different ideas and different opinions, you might recall from some of our episodes before that some of the signers were trying to negotiate, trying to compromise with the British Crown. Obviously, none of that happened, but this is just, I think, a very good way for one of the delegates here to express the sentiment that a lot of these signers felt. No doubt some of these signers really felt the pains and felt the consequences of doing such a heroic act in an unprecedented time. I'd like to share you a little story of just how much Clark really believed in this cause. As I mentioned earlier, his two sons served in the Revolutionary War. What was tragic was that they were actually both captured by the British. And the British knew that Clark was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and really wanted to not only put this pressure on a top official, but also to almost force the hand of someone who believed in this ideology of not wanting to use political power to get preferential treatment. Because Clark, as a notable member of the political class, shall we say, not in terms of the elite class, but in terms of the political representatives from New Jersey, he was obviously in a prominent position to negotiate, particularly with the British, or to have Congress to negotiate with the British on the release of prisoners. Clark really did not believe that this should be the norm for public officials to use their power to gain preferential treatment. I read that one of his sons went through such harsh treatment by the British that he could only eat through the keyhole in the door. And even though his sons were in utmost pain, he was given this ultimatum by the British. Either renounce your support for the Declaration of Independence and for the independence cause. In return, we would swiftly release your sons. Clark refused. I think that sort of commitment to the independence cause is just unbelievable. It's unbelievable to see that sort of sacrifice. And I'm not entirely sure what the fate of those sons were, but you can imagine how much that was and how much of pain Clark felt having to make that decision. I mean, how many times have we been able to really see in history, able to see someone so committed to the independence cause as to go to those kind of lengths? It also, of course, exposed, as we saw with the delegate Richard Stockton, regarding his treatment by the British. It was a very, very tough time, not just with the war, with the casualties on the battlefield and the illnesses, but also just the treatment of prisoners under the British. It was unbelievable. It was like a whole other level of slavery, essentially. But I just thought I would share that story to illustrate the kind of belief that Clark had for the independence movement. It was such a big deal, and I think he should be remembered for that huge sacrifice he made. Now, I was looking through to see what kind of excerpts or kinds of research that have been done on Abraham Clark. I want to go back to that theme of how he was very much in support for the commoners. He himself was a bit more of a commoner than a lot of his fellow delegates. I recently found this really interesting article by Ruth Bogan. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And Bogan had written a piece, an academic article on Abraham Clark. And she does a very good job, I think, of dissecting the key principles and some of the quotes from Clark himself on the values he espoused. And so I'd like to go through a few of these main points and just to explain a little bit about why this is such a big deal for this time. One of the first things that Clark emphasized in his pamphlet on the true policy, which was a major written work that he had written about, of course, someone who was very involved in New Jersey politics. He cared a lot about the state's economy and the well-being. He spoke a lot about the point of the Republican legislature. Not Republican as in party, but a Republican as in a representative body. From the article, he spoke how the duty of the representatives was to, quote, watch for the good of the state, unquote. They needed to recognize that, quote, mankind are generally governed by selfish principles and inclined to evil, unquote. This also stems a lot from the idea from James Madison, that quote of if men were angels, right? There would be basically no point in government. And he was kind of saying this a similar, in a different take here, but he does say along the same lines that there's a selfishness among people and that government needs to be able to limit those passions for evil and for selfishness. He recognized that the government itself is not an impartial structure, and it should not be for the privileged and for the most powerful. So continuing down through this article, Clark believed that the purpose of a legislature was to defend the constituents. He also said that legislatures had the obligation to interfere in situations, quote, where combination is formed against the general good. What he means is that the government needs to be able to identify these particular areas of policy where the general good, as a lot of people would say, the public interest, where the public interest is not being achieved. He also told some of these lawmakers, because he obviously knew a lot of these people who were involved in New Jersey politics, reminded them that the lawmakers needed to help the feeble against the mighty and deliver the oppressed out of the hands of the oppressor. He also warned of these greedy, moneyed men. It's kind of the first time I've heard moneyed men, but I guess what he means is just very, very wealthy people. He warned of the greedy, moneyed men not yet satisfied who pressed for further opportunities to, quote, grind the face of the needy. Clark also said that if the righteous are in authority, the people will rejoice and the state will be established in peace. I'll stop there for a second to point out that this idea of supporting the more industrial sectors, which he previously cited, including the farmers, the workers, in essentially factories, not in terms of the Industrial Revolution, which of course that did not happen at the time, but just the people who were the tradesmen, the people who were making things, essentially. If you can really boil it down, it's really not much of the services sector. It was more of the manufacturing and the agriculture sector. He really, truly believed that in order for New Jersey or any state to succeed, it has to be able to grow those sectors, not simply the service sector. And when he mentions service sector, he actually railed against quite a few professions here. Rail against lawyers, rail against even ministers, which I'm not sure how John Witherspoon, the Reverend himself, took that. He railed against doctors. I don't think he was essentially saying that they were just completely useless. He doesn't. I'm sure there was some interesting jokes that were probably made about some of these professions at the time, and even nowadays. However, what he was saying was that he warned of this, in a way, a tyranny of just serving for the wealthiest people and not for most of the population. This is clearly a very, very different idea that a lot of other delegates had. And it wasn't to say that other delegates only preferred the wealthy. It was, I think, part of it was more of just how much more overt Clark was on this idea. And there were certainly some delegates who would push back against this. They would kind of warn, saying, well, we still need to have a certain class of people who know these matters, who are well connected, I guess. But Clark warned about how tyranny is not just going to be originating from the British. It could also happen here in America. And what an insightful thing for him to say. I mean, truly, as you look, especially with the benefit of hindsight, of just how this tyranny can emerge from these different sectors. And certainly he saw that as a bit of a warning sign for his state of New Jersey and for the rest of the nation. He also spoke a lot about the right to petition, which is, of course, one of the fundamental rights under the First Amendment. A lot of his fellow delegates would argue that you need to have more concentration of these representatives, and because the representatives should be the ones who are making the best decisions. And Clark probably may have accepted some of that in the sense that of a Republican legislature voting for people to represent you. But he also warned about how, going back to his previous argument, that those people could very well be representing their own interests and not the interests of the constituents. And so Clark actually told his fellow countrymen of New Jersey, he told them to, quote, stand no longer idle, but to mobilize against the moneyed men, merchants, and lawyers who were, quote, very industrious, unquote, in seeking their goals. He was not one to be in favor of crossing constitutional boundaries, which I think is so important, especially now when it seems like so many norms are being broken now by our political class. He called for something that I thought was very interesting, and this is a direct quote. He said, quote, use humble petitioning only, and no doubt you may be heard. If not, your only remedy is in the next election of representatives, unquote. Think about how big of a statement that was. I wondered a bit more on what he meant by humble petitioning. But I guess that a part of the humble petitioning element is not this idea of just railing against someone, yelling at a representative, and not having any substance whatsoever. I don't think that is particularly effective. I mean, there's so much science on how when someone gets angry and then you start yelling at them back, that's not going to really make that other person like you even more, at least at the moment. And perhaps that's what he meant, or perhaps it meant that it needs to be some kind of realism when it comes to petitioning. I know people have very passionate views of certain policies, but one has to understand that you're up against a lot of other people who have what they think are very pressing issues. And there's clearly, I think, a sense of apathy among a lot of people to feel like they're not being heard. And there's a lot of reason to believe that. However, the fundamental element is this idea of elections, so that if people do not like their representatives, they can vote them out. And that's what the point that he's trying to make here, I think. Just to wrap up the kind of main points that he put out, which is that he really believed in this idea of liberty. He really wanted to bring about that the commoners in this what he saw as this hierarchy. He wanted to bring out the artisans, the tradesmen, the people who really essentially work with their hands, I guess you could say, at that time, and people who really he thought were the bedrock of society. He also gave a lot of passionate arguments for paper money, and really defending the reasons why New Jersey should be adopting paper money as part of its economic policies. He, as the article says, and I'm quoting from the article here, says, quote, "Instead of ascribing honor and decency to creditors and vilifying debtors, Clark saw creditors as parasites living idly on the labor of industrious debtors who were caught in their grip," unquote. Boy, I really think about not just the national debt, but the amount of credit card debt I'm seeing nowadays, just the student loan debt. I mean, debt really is a form of slavery. And it's not to say that debt should be illegal. It's the idea that it's a slavery that is very much imposed by the debtors. When we think a lot about personal responsibility and fiscal responsibility, this is something that I hope it will be more of a virtue being taught in our schools and at home, knowing that the idea that there's certainly a whole element of people taking advantage of debt and using that as part of a way to grow their own fortunes. And I think Clark would agree with that sort of problem. I just hope that this quote really makes us reflect on the importance of fiscal responsibility, knowing that he was also concerned that a state like New Jersey at the time was too dependent on other states and perhaps other foreign countries. I mean, that is a huge, huge argument, especially just generally on economic policy, knowing that over the last few decades, certainly 30 years ago, this idea of free trade, which may have had some good intentions, but has undoubtedly created a lot of poverty and a lot of destitution across the United States. And it's the reason why we're seeing some of this populist element of people who understandably want to just get their jobs back, want to see economic growth again, and they see income inequality getting worse, and they feel like they're not being heard. More on that a little bit later, but I just want to bring about some of these quotes from the article and from Clark on contemporary issues. And the last thing I will say from this article, which is he speaks a lot about the true policy, and I'll get to the true policy toward the end of the episode here. He said, Clark says, quote, "We are one of the United States," speaking about New Jersey. And generally speaking, we stand for and by ourselves. He basically mentions how New Jersey is part of the Union, but also has to be able to fight for itself. The article states that New Jersey had to define its own true policy to improve its great strength. Otherwise, as Clark would put it, quote, "Our boasted liberty may prove but a delusive dream," unquote. And I'll conclude my analysis of the article here, but just as a brief takeaway, one thing what he's saying is that we can't just rest on our laurels. Whether you're in New Jersey or in Wyoming or in Colorado or Texas, whatever state you live in, you have to be able to know how to defend your own state's interests, knowing that it's not to say that other states are inferior or that you need to put down a state or own a state for whatever reason, for political purposes. It's to know that that each state, each of the 50 states, has to be able to develop its own policies to be able to succeed, and not to just blame other states or blame other people in other levels of government. And this is something that I fear it's happening a lot. I mean, a lot of times I'm seeing these rows between elected officials on cultural issues, on economic issues. I'm thinking to myself, what in the world are these people doing? If they're a state official, they should be more concerned about what's happening in their state, and not in this sort of a back and forth fight on what state's better or worse. I mean, you can look at numbers, people can look at weather. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of doing things, but it seems to be distracting from the larger prioritization of state issues. And so, just to wrap up, I'll wrap up on Clark's life here. Once again, he was one who was very much revered. Even though I think a number of these delegates may not have agreed with some of the things that he said, but Clark was obviously a revolutionary within a revolution, I would argue. One to bring about a lot of these common issues of income inequality, concern about the elite taking advantage of the aristocracy, which, depending on how you see it, you can kind of see this idea of opportunity, but also of other. You can see from the history of American politics how some of these wings of more extreme ideologies came about, maybe in part because of some of these broader principles. If you look at more of the far left and the far right, I personally don't agree with those extremes, but just to kind of illustrate how a lot of these principles that we build America on, maybe we just need to look a bit more on where these origins come from. Not to mention that a number of people who say that, the founders had old ideas. Well, if one were to speak about the kinds of issues that Clark was discussing, I think it would have a lot more salience than people want to imagine. Clark was unfortunately unable to make it to the Constitutional Convention. He certainly wanted to be there, but due to ill health, he retired before the state had their Constitutional Convention in 1794. He passes away from sunstroke at his home in Union County, New Jersey. And he is buried in Rahway, New Jersey. He passed away on September 15th, 1794, at the age of 68. Now let's reflect on the life and the lessons of Abraham Clark. I think the first lesson here is we have to first find common ground on the importance of growing the economy as a whole, and not just among the more elite professions. I would also tack on to that saying we can't just grow one sector or a handful of sectors. I always use the analogy of growing the pie, right? If you think of let's say a 12-inch pizza pie, right? If you can make a larger pizza, let's say an 18-inch pizza, that's more pizza for everybody. Instead of just a zero-sum game where you're just assuming, well, how do we divide this and that? And there's certainly policies that do that, but what about the opportunity to grow the economy? Everyone says we need to grow the economy. However, we can't just grow the pie, right? We have to ensure that it's not just one side of the pizza that's growing. It's the fact that the entire pizza pie of the economy is growing. This obviously stems from Clark's philosophy about how we can't just grow certain sectors, and I think he's absolutely right. If we just have certain elite professions, I think that is such a detrimental element to our economy. It has not been a secret for anyone who knows me. It is not a secret that I believe we need to really boost the element of apprenticeships and of having more tradesmen. My family has been doing a lot of work on our amazing little house in Nevada, and I cannot tell you how impressive these construction workers or these contractors and plumbers and electricians and people who deliver the refrigerators. I mean, those people who work so hard to support basically how we live in our society. Almost every single one of them, probably every single one of them, has told us that there're just not enough workers. And I'm concerned that the state of our country is in a position where we are not prioritizing our full economy. We are just, generally speaking, thinking that we need to produce just academics or just doctors or just politicians even. But we're not thinking of the entire country. And I think Clark really sends a resonant message to all of us today that we need to grow those sectors. While certainly the industrial sector at the time in the 1700s is a lot different than now, and people would argue that your technology has changed and whatnot, and clearly there's a lot of argument to bring in new technology. However, there's nothing like the creativity and nothing like the original work that these people put in to make things, to still be able to do things. A lot of things, whether it's contracting work or construction work, we still need people. It's not like we can just use technology and just replace people at all. We need to find a symbiotic relationship between AI and construction, or AI and whatever sector you can think of. But the common element is just finding more policies. So hopefully among Democrats and Republicans and independents, or people who are just not affiliated at all, I hope there is some kind of commonality to be able to agree that we can at least find some ways to bring more jobs and to bring more opportunities for a lot of these professions. The second takeaway is we need to remember the importance of the legislature and representative government. I added to this item here, which is we need to include citizens' participation. I mean, if we just had a legislature of representatives and no one showed up to any meetings or no one cared about what they did, then how can we expect a legislator to represent constituents when really the only time that they're representing anyone is representing themselves, because there's no one else there? And this really brings back to what Clark was saying about the importance of the right to petition. Now, he does mention humble petitions, which again, I would say is a message for people to be more reasoned in their petition, to not just write letters or Facebook messages or comments saying that this representative is such and such. That just doesn't help. It doesn't add on to the virtues of representative government. It doesn't bring about the actual grievances that people have. When we know that there are real problems that are affecting the electorate and affecting people in their daily lives, for those kinds of derogatory and useless comments for those to be a dominant part of the right to petition, I think is a mistake. And we need to find new ways to bring out the opportunities for people to bring out real grievances and to be articulate, to be able to specifically say, this is what is happening. Now, people might not know the answer to these policies. This is up to the legislators. But we just need, I think, a healthier relationship between constituents and representatives. And for representatives, obviously, there needs to be a very big understanding of the mandate that is put on them. It is not an easy job, but I think knowing the importance of the legislature as an institution, I think could go a long way and perhaps avoid some of these violations of constitutional proceedings that we have seen in this day and age. And lastly, I encourage people to find their true policy. This is a term that is used by Clark, and I'll finally define it for you all. The way he says it is that true policy is when government provides the inhabitants with equal access to new opportunities as they unfolded. You know, having that equal access to new opportunities, isn't that something that we can all agree on? isn't it nice to be able to find out exactly what, again, going back to that first point, growing the pie, growing these new opportunities. A lot of times we get into these arguments about who's right and who's wrong, but I think a lot of times people miss out on the opportunities to help others or to be able to help others with a voice. I think the true policy element, I think trueness to me at least, and this is just Sherman Tylowski's perspective, I also think true policy also reflects authenticity. Having authentic thoughts and beliefs and policies and ideas. We need more authenticity in our politics today. We need more true policies, not just policies that signal, someone's virtues or someone's better than everyone else. We don't need that. What we need is genuine policy. People who can put the energy and the time to make people's lives better. And so I encourage all of you to find your true policy. Find out what it is that you believe could deliver better results for your community, for your state, for your nation. As a reference to JFK's famous quote, this is perhaps a way for you to ask what you can do for your country. And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode about Abraham Clark, the final delegate from New Jersey. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have already, make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens if you haven't already. And of course, a very happy holidays to all of you. I hope you enjoy the winter festivities, and I wish you all a very happy new year. As always, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens. And I will see you all next year in 2024.